Again, the Q&A at the bottom, make sure that you put questions in that because it keeps them topical, so we can go back and answer things one at a time and kind of check them off. It's difficult for me to keep up with all the different windows on the screen while we're going through here. Aaron is here with me just, well, for a lot of reasons, but for one, to try to answer questions that he can as we go through this. And he's a great photographer on his own, and is very familiar with macro too. So he'll be able to answer a lot of your questions. And then if there's something really important or really topical, he will jump on camera and let me know, and I can answer questions then. But definitely will leave time for questions at the end of the presentation as well. So remember, if you are local to Kenmore Camera, you can join on the photo walk next week. Sigma will be supplying some lenses for people to try out and use during that time. So even if you don't have the right camera, or the right lens, sorry, you'll be able to utilize something to photograph. And then the following week, we'll be back here for an image review. Okay, without any further ado, I guess we'll jump into the presentation. I always focus on flowers for macro photography anyway, for a lot of reasons. One, it's probably the most common thing that is photographed with macro lenses or any kind of close-up techniques or anything like that. Two, it's something that's kind of near and dear to my heart. It's something that I end up photographing quite a bit anyway. So, sorry. I'll give you a little bit of background about me. I am the Southeastern Tech Rep for Sigma. I'm the education coordinator for the company as well. Saying that to say that I met a gentleman at a Photoshop World down in Orlando about 10 years ago now, 11 years ago. And after talking to him about stores and equipment and sales side of things, he looked at me and said, "You actually know what you're talking about." And I just laughed. I was quite shocked that somebody would actually say something like that to a sales rep. But and he said, "I teach workshops. Come teach one with me." And I said, "That sounds fantastic. Where are we going?" And he said, I am in the Smoky Mountains twice a year in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. And I said, "Absolutely love it. It's one of my favorite places on earth. What are we photographing?" He said, "Flowers." I said, "I don't know anything about flowers. I just know they're pretty." He said, "No, that's fine. I'll take people to them. I'll tell them all about the flower. You just teach them how to take pictures." Well, fast forward, and now I do workshops every spring. Actually, I do 2 workshops in the Smokies every year, but one in particular in spring every year just to photograph wildflowers in the Smokies. So it's something that has become kind of a passion of mine as well. And I'll be able to tell you a lot of the flowers that are in the slides as we go through here. I'll try to remember to point out some of those things. What I really want you to see as we go through this, the camera is not so much relevant, even though this is an older camera and an older image, but what I want you to look at are the specs down at the bottom, the metadata, if you will, specifically the aperture, shutter speed, ISO, the lens too, so you can get an idea what's being done. But what I want you to see that F11, if I'm shooting a landscape, a waterfall, F11 probably gives me the whole thing in focus. On a flower, F11 doesn't even give me the entire flower in focus. What I wanted though is that center of this flower, and this is a flower called a bloodroot. There are two opinions as to why they're, oh, I'm sorry, that's a different flower. They're called bloodroots because the Native Americans, the Cherokee in that area, I believe it was the Cherokee, used to make paint out of the roots of the flower, and it's kind of the color of blood. They're very, very delicate. You can breathe on them wrong and all the petals fall off. They tend to only last a day or two because the wind just knocks all the petals off of them. So they're kind of fun to find when you see them, and you have to photograph them quickly in the springtime. And I don't remember the name of this one. I apologize. I just told you I would know. But so F32, and this time I have the entire flower in focus, even the little buds behind it, and the background is starting to go nice and soft. So aperture is one of the key ways that you're going to play around with focus on the subject versus focus in the background. It's easy to isolate a subject from the background by making the background soft. That's difficult with macro, to make the background soft but still get focus on the subject. So it's something that takes a lot of trial and error. Even on an individual flower, I may end up photographing things at a lot of different apertures in order to get the look that I'm going for. That is a rue anemone, another flower in the park. These all three of these so far are in the Smokies, and again at f11, utilizing that to get the front of the flower in focus, the second bud soft, and then the background nice and out of focus. Okay. Just so we're all aware on the same page that we're talking about the same thing. Typically or traditionally, technically, macro means 1-to-1. It means life-size reproduction. And what we're talking about is what the lens itself is capable of doing. I don't care what the camera can do. I don't care if I'm using a crop sensor, medium format, full frame, APS-C, micro four thirds, whatever else there may be. If I take the image back into the computer, I can enlarge it any way I want. Even on the screen on the back, I can enlarge it. What we're talking about here is what the lens itself is capable of doing. If you want to get real technical, macro is about 1-to-1 to 100-to-1, at which point it becomes micro, but we're not ever going to be close to that range. With some techniques and tools, you could get to 2-to-1, 3-to-1, maybe 5-to-1. But normally we're looking at lenses that are capable of 1-to-1. That's pretty typical of a true macro lens. An ordinary lens, a standard lens though, isn't capable of true macro. Most lenses are capable of somewhere around 1-to-4, 1-to-5, 1-to-6, 1-to-7, something in that range. So it can reproduce a subject at about 20%, 25% of life size, maybe a little bit less. What gets tricky though is you'll see marked on lenses the term macro for lenses that can magnify the subject a little bit more than a standard lens, but not as much as a true macro lens, a true 1-to-1. So you'll see that when lenses are capable of like 1-to-2 or 1-to-3. Just something to watch out for. It's usually in the manufacturer's specification somewhere. I can give you one rule of thumb, and that is if it's a zoom lens, it's probably not capable of 1-to-1. It's probably going to be in that 1-to-3 range. But then even if it's a prime, it may not be a true 1-to-1. It may only be a 1-to-2. In order to magnify an image, without getting real technical, the focus group, the elements in the middle of a lens, when you're focused at infinity, when you're focused on a mountain 10 miles away, that focus group, those elements of glass, are the closest to the sensor that they'll ever be with anything in focus. And as you focus closer, those elements have to move farther away. The reason that most lenses can't do macro is they just can't extend far enough. They can't move those focus elements far enough away from the sensor in order to focus close enough to the camera to make the subject life size. Hope that made some sense, but there are some ways to do that with some accessories, and we'll talk about those toward the end of the presentation as well. To an extent, a true macro lens, the focus elements have to be twice as far away from the sensor as they were at infinity. And again, that's not something that most lenses are able to do, but that's why a lot of macro lenses are longer or extend a lot as you focus closer. So just this old, one of our older lenses, the 50mm macro. And again, even at f16, you can notice the very front surface of this blueberry is soft, and you're getting back here and these are soft. And that was just about at 1-to-1, full life size. So a normal orchid, Phalaenopsis. This is what I would call an artificial shot. The flowers are real, and they came from the botanical garden or the garden store down the street. The background is a print. We'll talk about this when we talk about some techniques and stuff later, but the lighting is artificial. But the idea is to try to make something look as natural as possible. And this is something that you could recreate in your house, in your living room as well, and not have to go outside when the weather's bad or whatever the case may be. Like I said, we'll come back to some of the techniques in that when we talk about accessories and things like that. So not a traditional macro lens. Our 100 to 400, which is actually this lens here on the table in front of me, if you can still see me. It is, I don't know actually what the true magnification is, probably about 1 to 3 or 1 to 4. But for something like a butterfly, that's perfectly sufficient. So if you imagine that butterfly is 3 or 4 inches long and it's only not even half, maybe a third of the distance across the frame. So it's not anywhere close to life size, but it's a very good lens to use for this type of subject matter because I can be a lot farther from the subject. I don't have to risk scaring the subject away. In this case, I don't have to put myself in harm's way if I'm shooting something that might sting me or something else like that. So a lot of times for bug photography, we're using longer macro lenses or longer long zooms like this, a 100 to 400, sometimes even the 150 to 600s. So what do we use macro lenses for? Like I said, the most common thing, probably the #1 answer that I always get if I ask groups is flowers. And that's really what where my passion lies. I love to photograph bugs when I can find them as well, but I have friends who order bugs, scientific specimens, set things up in their living rooms to take these great pictures, and I'm not that dedicated to bug photography. Um, Food, you've seen a few images in here, but it's something that can be fun. Collections, all sorts of things that you might have lying around the house. Macro has been one of the most popular things over the last 16, 18 months while we've all been at home or been home more often. A lot of people have been photographing macro in and around their house. And so it's kind of fun to look at textures and details in things in ways that you would normally not see something. You can also use them though, stamps, currency, jewelry, collectibles, anything that has little marks on them, serial numbers, things like that. You can use macro lenses to get in and photograph those for insurance purposes or just to preserve that information or whatever the case may be. If you're using your iPhone to do that, you're basically doing the same thing, right? Or your cell phone. You can zoom in on something and use the macro capabilities of a phone to do exactly the same thing for documenting things like that. One thing that a lot of people don't think about is portraiture. Macro lenses tend to be in a normal portrait length range. Our macro lenses that we make today, we have a 70mm lens and two 105mm lenses. We'll talk about that in just a minute, what we offer and what some other companies offer. But both of those are ideal portrait lenses. The 70 is kind of on the short range on a full frame camera. On an APS-C camera, it's a longer portrait lens. The 105 on a full frame is a beautiful portrait length. And on an APS-C camera, it's quite a long portrait length, but for a tight headshot, it could be really, really useful. Macro lenses are already very, very sharp lenses. So they're very ideally suited for that type of work as well. They tend to have wider apertures like 2.8, so they're going to be the same aperture as your 24-70s and 70 to 200s. So again, it's something that you might be able to do with the lens that you already have. And then another one that doesn't occur to very many people is art reproduction. Most art reproduction is done with macro lenses in the kind of shorter macro range, the 70, 90, maybe 105, depending on how big something is. Again, they're extremely sharp lenses. They're flat field lenses, meaning that there's not usually much curvature to the focus field. So when I focus on the middle of a painting, the edges of the painting are sharp too, without having to stop down to f16 or f22 or something like that. They tend to be very corrected lenses, so they're rectilinear. They tend to have very, very little distortion. So again, if you're photographing artwork, you don't want everything to curve, right? So something else you can do with them. I just like thinking of knowing what else I could do with a piece of equipment. Sometimes I don't like spending money on something if I can only use it for one thing, right? In any case, so another one of our older lenses, the 150. Aperture on this doesn't really make a lot of difference because it really is flat. There's just a little bit of surface depth to it. So I probably could have focused or photographed this with most any aperture, and it would still be sharp. But obviously, the higher the aperture, the longer my shutter speed has to be. And then even this at f/16, I have the feet and the head and some of the body in focus. The tails just starting to go soft. The wings are definitely soft. So you can see that even at f/16, there's not a ton of depth of field. A good lesson in paying attention to your surroundings. I was at an event, I'd loaned out lenses. People were all in class and I was just sitting at the table in the trade show booth getting some work done. Turn around and this guy is sitting on the window behind me. So he was very nice to sit and wait for me to grab a lens and a camera and put them together and turn around and take his picture. Again, this one has a little bit more depth to it because of the curl of some of these stamps. So, and I wanted to make sure that the top and the bottom of that depth was all in focus. So I photographed that at f/16. If you're not familiar, depth of field goes directly away from the sensor in the camera. The focus plane tends to be parallel to the sensor in the camera or the film, and then depth of field is going to move forward or backward from there. So you can utilize that when you're photographing something flat. If you keep the camera sensor parallel to the surface, your depth of field is better utilized more efficiently for photographing things like that. All right, the offerings from Sigma. So we currently have a 70 millimeter DG, meaning it is full frame. That's our designation for lenses designed for full frame cameras. DC being lenses that were designed for APS-C cameras or even micro four thirds. I think that's it, but smaller format sensors. The 70 millimeter was the first art lens in the first macro lens in the art series. How's that? It is available in a Canon EF mount and Sony E mount, and the L mount, which is Sigma, Leica, and Panasonic's full frame cameras that share a mount as well. The 105EX, which is how do I say that? The EX was our designation for highest grade lenses before we started to make art lenses. It is available in Canon EF and Nikon F mount. So they're SLRs. Again, it's full frame. OS is stabilization, optical stabilization. So both of those lenses for full frame, the 105 is a little bit longer and the 105 has stabilization. For Sony cameras, the 70 millimeter is going to be stabilized in the camera body as well. The newest lens in the macro lineup is our 105 28 Dgdn. Again, DG being full frame. DN is our designation for a lens that was designed specifically for mirrorless cameras. The optical formula was created to work with specifically for mirrorless cameras. So it's available in Sony E mount, and it's available in L mount, again, that Leica, Panasonic, and Sigma alliance that we share. That's my favorite macro lens right now. It's unbelievably sharp. The focus is extremely precise. It gets more accurate, I guess, more sensitive as you focus closer to the camera, which is something that SLR lenses couldn't do because the lenses, the optical elements in the lens are mechanically coupled to the focus ring, but in most mirrorless lenses, they're not. So you can change the sensitivity of the focus ring through the camera body, through accessories, or just the manufacturers can do that in the way they make the lenses. The other macro lenses, again, not true macro lenses, that's why I put it in quotes, but those lenses are all capable of somewhere around a third of life size, 1 to 2.9 or 1 to 3. And that would be the 18 to 200, the 18 to 300, the 17 to 70 DC contemporary lenses, again in Canon EF mount or Nikon F mount. As far as the magnification is concerned, If you're shooting larger subjects, you don't necessarily need something that's going to be capable of reproducing one-to-one. The next question is always, what focal length should I use? And we'll come back to that one in just a second. I've got a whole slide to try to help you pick a focal length for a macro lens. So again, even at f/22, this is a flower called a yellow trillium. Trillium are, to me, quite intriguing. There's all sorts of different varieties. White and yellow and red and purple, and some have white with little purple lines on them that are just beautiful. They're called trillium because they have 3 petals, 3 leaves, 3 stamen, 3 pistils. They're all, everything's in 3s, unless you find a mutant. But, and this is, the yellow trillium are kind of erect, so the petals will stay, the leaves will stay parallel to the ground, and those petals usually stick straight up. Sometimes they'll start to curl and drop down just a little bit. So this is looking straight down on the top of a flower. This is not in the Smoky Mountains. This is actually in a garden in Nashville called Cheekwood. If you've ever been to that area, if you're familiar with that. It is 100% natural, meaning that I did not add all those water droplets. I'll teach you later how to add those water droplets, all that morning dew. You can shoot something in your living room or in the middle of the afternoon and simulate this look. But I didn't touch this one. This is the one that I was starting to tell you about before. This is a flower called a Trout Lily. And there are 2 schools of thought as to why they're called that, or 2 opinions that I've heard anyway. The first is that these tend to bloom at the same time as the trout are spawning. That's what my friend who is Cherokee tells me. The other is that this one doesn't have a lot. Some of them are very, very speckled. The petals have lots of spots down them. And some people say they look kind of like a speckled or rainbow trout with all the spots on them. And so they call them trout lilies for that reason. They're beautiful flowers to me. They're extremely small. Those petals are probably not more than an inch long. From the very tip of the stamen and the pistils to the top of the petals might be about 2 inches. They're usually within 4 or 5 inches of the ground, even with the stem coming up. So they're very, very difficult to photograph and have a decent background. This is, in 12 years of going to the park to photograph flowers and photographing flowers all over, this is probably the only trout lily I ever found at the top of a bank with nothing else behind it for 20 or 30 feet. So this is straight out of camera. I really did blur the background out that much to isolate this flower, just because I finally found one that looked this way. So it's a good lesson. Don't just look for the perfect flower, look for the perfect environment around that flower as well. So if you ever follow me walking up a trail, I might pass 100 flowers, and once the trout lilies are out, they're usually relatively common. You'll find a lot of them. When the trillium are in bloom, there are thousands of trillium that cover the fields. Fusilia is the same way. So depending on what you're looking for, some flowers you might find 1 or 2, but some of them you're going to find a lot while you're walking around. So don't just look for an interesting flower, but look for a good opportunity to photograph that flower as well. All right, how do we pick a macro lens? So the first thing to me to consider when I'm choosing a macro lens, or if I'm looking to purchase a macro lens, or if I'm advising somebody on what macro lens to use or buy, and that is working distance. I'm going to separate working distance from what manufacturers will call close focus distance or minimum focus distance. Close focus distance, minimum focus distance are measured from the sensor in the camera, not the front of the lens. There's actually a little mark. I'm trying to find it on here real quick. Right there on this camera, you can't see that, but there's a circle with a line through it somewhere on your camera body. I almost guarantee it. That's a mark of where the sensor is. It's the sensor plane in the camera. And close focus distance and minimum focus distance are measured from that point to the closest subject that the lens is capable of focusing. For a lens like this is the 60 to 600, but a 600 millimeter lens, it doesn't make a whole lot of difference if I'm measuring from here or from here if the close focus distance is 10 feet away. It changes it by a foot, but chances are, if I'm shooting a bird in flight, the difference of 9 or 10 feet is irrelevant because I'm never that close to the subject. But for macro lenses, it makes a huge difference. You might look in the specs online and see that the minimum focus distance is listed as 18 inches. And that sounds fantastic that you can get 1-to-1 from 18 inches away until you realize that the lens is 12 inches long. And now I'm only 6 inches from the subject, which still may be sufficient. But for shorter lenses like the 50, 60, 70 millimeter lenses, I'm going to end up being, again, manufacturer specs are going to tell me 8, 10, 12 inches. In reality, I'm only going to be 2 or 3 inches away from the subject, from the front of the lens. We'll come back to that in just a second as well. I've got a whole slide just to talk about that part. The next is angle of view. And there's no right or wrong to any of these things, especially the first two to me. The angle of view is just how much background do I want to see? A shorter macro lens like a 50 is going to see a lot more environment, a lot more background behind the subject. That may be great. It may not make any difference if I'm in my living room. It just means my background has to be a little bit larger, whatever it is I'm using for a background. So that could be fine. And if I'm shooting something larger, it means that I don't have to be 3 feet away from the subject in order to photograph it. But if I want a narrow angle of view, a longer macro lens like a 180 or a 200 might be more appropriate because it will isolate the subject from the background more easily. But again, if I'm shooting a larger subject, I might be 3 feet away from it, and that doesn't always work. I've hiked in places, photographed flowers in places that I was on one side of the trail from a flower, and if I had a longer lens, I wouldn't have been able to photograph it. I wouldn't have been able to back up enough to get the shot. Stabilization. I used to say that macro lenses needed stabilization built into the lenses. Today, a lot of cameras have stabilization built into them. Somewhere in that combination, it's nice to have stabilization if you're going to try to handhold an image. On a tripod, you want to turn the stabilizer off anyway. But if I'm trying to follow something, chase a bug, even if I'm using a monopod with a long lens to photograph butterflies or dragonflies or something like that, it's nice to have a stabilizer in the system, again, whether it's in the lens or the camera body. Size, weight, price. The price is something you've got to figure out for yourself. The size and weight. One of my favorite macro lenses that I've ever used is our older 180 2.8. It is one of the overall sharpest lenses I've ever used, period. The problem is it's bigger and heavier than our 70 to 200. It takes up the space of 2 other lenses in my camera bag. And if I'm shooting something larger than an inch, I have to be 3 feet away from it. So there are a lot of limitations to that lens. Very rarely do I choose it to go hiking. I'll take something like our 105 and then take another lens like a 14-24, 24-70 that I can do landscapes with while I'm out photographing as well. And I just have less gear to carry around that way. My camera bag weighs less. My back is happier with me when I get back to the car. So there definitely are choices to be made for choosing lenses. And then, like we were talking about before, what else are you going to do with the lens? Is this something that I want to buy one lens and be able to do a lot of things with it? Or do I just want to buy a macro lens for this particular purpose? This was a lesson in patience as well. This is with our 150. Even at f/22, I must have photographed this this fern 30, 40, 50 times. It kept moving in the breeze. So that was annoying to get the focus exactly where I wanted to be. It was hard enough just to focus beforehand. And we'll talk about some techniques for that in just a second. But then I was playing around with different apertures to get some blur in the background, not enough, so much that the background was just totally out of focus, but still leave enough depth of field in the fiddlehead as well. And I don't know my butterflies very well. This was at a butterfly garden. I believe this was done in outside of Phoenix, Arizona. There's a really nice butterfly garden there. There's also one down in Fort Lauderdale, or just north of Fort Lauderdale, if you're anywhere in South Florida, that I believe is called Butterfly World, actually. That one I do remember. These are flowers called Dutchman's Breeches. And again, this was in camera. One of the few times that I photographed a flower at f8, but I was a little farther away, so I had a little more depth of field, and I just wanted those front flowers in focus, and I wanted them to get softer and fall off, and I wanted the background to be completely out of focus. So that was a deliberate choice as far as that goes. The flowers called Dutchman's Breeches, there are 3 different plants that look almost identical, or at least in the Smoky Mountains, there are 3 plants. There may be others that look like that too, I don't know. But they're bleeding hearts, Dutchman's breeches, and squirrel corn. They're 3 different flowers. They're very, very hard to tell the plants apart until they bloom. And if you look at the flowers, you'll see some bleeding hearts in here later. You see the flowers look similar in structure. They just have different shapes and different colors in the case of bleeding hearts. But so back to working distance. Again, measuring from the front of the lens, not from the sensor. So what I did is take a camera, put it on a tripod, and put it on a long lens plate, about 1 foot long, so I could slide the whole camera forward and backward without having to reposition the tripod or anything else. And then set up a subject, took the lens, put it in manual focus, turned the lens all the way around to its closest focus, and then moved the camera until the subject was in focus. And then I just took out a tape measure and measured from the front of the lens to the subject. So it's not 100% accurate down to the nearest millimeter, but it's a close enough approximation for to figure out maybe where a starting point is for what lens you want to buy or what lens you want to use. So the first, if you look in that 50, 60, 70 millimeter range, we had made a 50, we have had a 70 then, we have a new 70 now. And I've tried other lenses in that 50, 60, 65, and 70 millimeter macro lens, and they're all going to be right in that same range of 2 to 3 inches from the front from the front piece of glass in the lens to the subject when you're focused at infinity. So that's the closest you'll ever be. Like I said, if you're shooting something larger, if I only want a 1/3 life size, that means I'm going to be 3 times back from that. So now I'm up to like 7 inches away. That's pretty reasonable. The problem is if I'm only 2 inches away from a subject, it's very difficult to light. I might be casting a shadow. If it's moving, it's very difficult to keep it in the frame. There's just lots of reasons why you don't necessarily want to be right on top of something. That 90, 100, 105 millimeter range, again, our lenses and other manufacturers' lenses, they're going to be in the 5 to 6 inch range from the front piece of glass in the lens to the subject. To me, that's a really nice working distance. It's again, I'm not right on top of something. I can still light a subject. If I'm shooting something larger, if I'm shooting a centipede, I'm probably 2 or 3 times that far back, maybe more. And so that's going to be acceptable. It's a good compromise. But if I'm shooting something really large, I don't have to be, again, 3 or 4 feet away like some of the really long stuff. So to me, that's kind of the sweet spot, especially for full frame cameras. Maybe for APS-C cameras, if you want to shoot things that are a little bit smaller than a lot more often, then lenses in that 90 to 105 range would be really useful. Lenses in the 150 millimeter range, that kind of category. Ours was 7.5 inches from the front element to the subject at 1:1 again, and the 180 is 8.75, almost 9 inches away. So again, at a 1/3 life size, that lens is now over 2 feet away, more than 2 feet away from the front piece of glass. Then you've got the length of the lens and the camera and everything else, trying to set it up. So the easy answer is, if you shoot small things more often or really often, if you shoot things that won't let you get close to them like bugs more often, you tend to go toward the longer end of the range. The 180 is extremely popular with dragonfly photographers, butterfly photographers, that kind of thing. If you're just looking for a general all-purpose kind of macro lens, even on a full frame camera, the 70 is really nice. On an APS-C camera, it's a great lens. And like I said, what my preference is going to be that 105 millimeter lens for most full frame cameras, and even a lot of people that are shooting APS-C. So back to talking about focal plane. If you notice, so butterfly, if I tried to shoot this at an angle and get all of the wings in focus, it would be very, very difficult. If he spread his wings out in this position and they came toward the camera and away from the camera, it would be very difficult to get all of that in focus in a single exposure. But because his wings are parallel to the focal plane in the camera, I'm looking just about straight on this butterfly, and his wings are sticking straight across the frame, that even at f8, I have the entire thing in focus. It just makes it a lot easier. So I'm looking for opportunities like that, and I'm trying to pay attention when I move from bug to bug or shot to shot. How is the subject positioned? Do I need to turn the aperture up? Do I need to turn the aperture, or can I turn the aperture down and get the ISO to go down and get a cleaner image? But you can even see on the tree, I don't know if you can see my pointer, but the trunk of the tree here, or the branch of the tree, is getting soft as it comes toward the camera. So you can see there's still not a lot of depth of field, but it was utilized efficiently enough to get all of him in focus. This is a flower called a purple hepatica. Again, even at f22, the very tips of the petals coming toward me are starting to get soft. But what I was looking for is that second flower to be soft, but still completely recognizable. I didn't want it so blurred that you couldn't tell what it was, but I didn't want it sharp, and I didn't want the background to be any sharper than it is. So like I said, I'm always playing around with that. And it's not like I just sit and look at a scene and say, oh, that's going to be f22, and take one picture and be done. A lot of this is trial and error. So I maybe take one picture at one aperture, try another one. We'll talk about the settings here in just a second as well. This is one I borrowed from Aaron. I don't know my dragonflies either, but I just love the shot. It's a really nice composition, a really nice look at the cross wings or across the wings of the dragonfly. So I like to throw that one in there. And it's good use of that 100 to 400 as well. All right, so we have our camera, and we have talked about lenses. The nice thing about macro is you can do this with just about any camera you already have. You don't need the latest, greatest, fastest, best low light performance, whatever camera to do macro. So other than those two things though, what do I really recommend? If you're gonna shoot bugs, a monopod is really useful. If you're gonna shoot flowers and some bugs, depending on how fast they move, a tripod is almost essential. If you're gonna do anything in your living room, it's fantastic because I can put the camera on a tripod, set up the subject, set up the lights. I can leave and go make a cup of coffee and come back and everything is still sitting right there. I don't have to set up a shot all over again or try to pick up the camera and figure out exactly what my point of view was, anything like that. For shorter shutter speeds with a macro lens at higher, remember we're magnifying the subject, we're magnifying the shake of your hands, the movement in the subject, all those things as well. So a tripod is a really, really good thing to have. I'm a fan of Arca Swiss. Arca Swiss is a Swiss company that makes cameras, tripod heads, things like that. They've been around for a long, long time. But their biggest contribution, in my opinion, at least, to the photo world is the closest thing we have to a universal standard in tripods. And there's an advantage to an Arca Swiss style plate, which we'll talk about here in just a second. If you're not aware, you can ask the folks at Kenmore to show you what Arca Swiss is. I'm sure you can look it up on Google as well. Some way to trigger the camera without using your finger on the shutter release button on the camera. So pushing the button is going to shake the camera. If you don't have any kind of cable release or a remote, an app, whatever else it is, and I don't care if it's wired or wireless, I don't like extra batteries to worry about, but whatever it is, whatever that is, if you have a way to trigger the camera, great. If you don't, use the timer in your camera, but I will tell you it's very challenging for photographing flowers. Inevitably, you think it's a still calm day, but there's going to be some kind of wind blowing the flowers around, and trying to time a photograph properly in between gusts of wind using the timer on the camera is almost impossible. So I really recommend you have some kind of cable release with you. So long lens plate The thing about Arca-Swiss is instead of a proprietary plate that is held in on all four sides or fits into a recess on all four sides, Arca-Swiss just clamps on the two edges of the plate. The head itself clamps onto the two sides. So the advantage to that is, or one advantage to that is, I can get long plates, 3 inches, 4 inches, 6 inches, whatever, 12 inches long if I want, and use them as a rail. In other words, I can put it underneath the camera. I can put it underneath the foot of a tripod collar if a lens has that, pointing straight toward the subject, and then I can unclamp the lens, unclamp the camera and the tripod head, and move the entire camera forward or backward. So I can change my magnification, I can change, enlarge the subject or move it down, change my composition a little bit without having to pick the whole camera up, the whole tripod up, reposition it, and set everything up again. So if you imagine, here's my flower and I'm looking down at a subject, if I take the camera and move it back a foot, I'm not pointing at the flower anymore. If I'm photographing a waterfall and I move back a foot, my composition doesn't change a whole lot. But if I do that with a flower, the flower's not even in the frame anymore. So now I have to adjust the camera. I'm changing my depth of field. I'm changing the composition, all those things. So if I can just slide the camera forward or backward, it means that I can reposition things and set the camera up for a new shot a lot more easily. Lights. I'm a big fan of having some sort of lights involved in macro photography. I used to use a macro flash like the one in the picture. I've got a photograph with that, using that I'll show you in just a second. Used to use flashlights that are daylight balanced because they're bright. They tend to be kind of harsh though. So everybody asks, so I actually remembered today. This is what I use. It is a little LED panel from a company called Photix. They don't make this anymore, so it doesn't matter if I tell you what model this is. Just look for something that looks like this. There are a dozen companies now that make something that's identical. One of the reasons I like it, I never carried around big LEDs with me because they were big. To have something that was this bright, 5 years ago, the LEDs were, 4 by 6 inches and they were 2 inches thick. And then they had to have battery packs and all that on top of that. This uses a little lithium ion battery in it, just like your cell phone. It will last an entire day of photographing. It'll stay on for an hour or two. It's bright enough to actually be useful, and it's a soft enough light because it's a larger surface area. It's a softer light than just a single bulb in a flashlight would be or something like that. You can change the color temperature. They make these now that will do like all sorts of special effects, and that's really irrelevant to what we're doing. But if you like those kind of things, you can find one that does all that. I just want something that goes from daylight to tungsten so I can warm an image up or whatever it is. Yeah, that. Reflector Diffuser. I like the 5-in-1s. If you find one like that, the 5-in-1s usually have a cover that unzips, and then the material over the frame itself on the inside is used for diffusion. You can hold the diffusion between a light source and the subject and soften the light, which means it's going to fill in the shadows and tame the highlights. You can do that on a background as well. If the subject's already in shadow, you can use the reflector to soften light on the background. But then you can put the cover back on, and there's usually black and white, silver, gold, sunlight, something else. You can use them to bounce light in, whether that's the silver gold side or the white side. You can actually use it to absorb light and keep it from bouncing in to darken shadows by using the black side. You can use the black or the white as a background in a pinch if you need to do that. You can hold them just outside of your image and help block the wind from your subject, from your flower. What else? You can use them to block light on the background. They're just a really nice, versatile tool to have in photographing. And it's something I usually carry around with me in the field. It's definitely something that I use when I'm shooting inside. They make all sorts of different sizes. The typical portrait ones fold up maybe 18 inches and open up to whatever that would be, 3 feet, 4 feet wide, something like that. That's great for portraits because we need to light something that's the size of a human in general, or half length or whatever it is. We're photographing flowers, we don't need that much light, and even folded up, that big is kind of hard to hike down a trail with. But when they're open and they're 3 or 4 feet wide and a gust of wind comes through, they're hard to hold on to as well. So they do make little ones that'll fold up like 5 or 6 inches. They make some even smaller than that. You want something that's at least about 12 or 15 inches when it's open, probably not more than 18 or 24 inches. But if you can find something that's about 15 or 18 inches, that's perfect. It'll do everything that you need to do for bouncing light, absorbing light, diffusing light, background, whatever the case may be. A couple other accessories. They make close-up filters. They're also called diopters or magnifying filters. They fit on the front of your lens and just magnify the light coming through. They're good ones and they're not so good ones. There's some that are dedicated to lenses. There's some that aren't. Our 18 to 300, we make a filter for it that takes it from 1 to 3 down to 1 to 2. It's never going to be as good as a lens that's capable of more magnification to begin with. But it can be a useful way to get more magnification out of a lens that doesn't have that already. I believe this is some kind of an orchid, a wild orchid that's in a botanical gardens. The thing that I want you to note is the ant on the back. I watched him climb all the way up the stem, climb out around some of the flowers. I took other photographs as well, but that's the one that I liked the most, is when he was on that bud in the back. Still very recognizable, but just a little bit soft. These are pink lady slippers. In the Great Smoky Mountains, we have 2 varieties of lady slippers, pink and yellow. I've heard rumors of other ones, but I've never seen a picture of another one from the park. This is natural morning dew as well, if you notice the little beads of water that are coming off of the flowers. Normally when we find these, they're a pretty rare flower. They're not easy to find. We know a few places that they tend to recur. We keep an eye on them every year and see how they're doing. Usually only find 1 or 2, maybe 3 plants at a time. If you notice this, there's some actually in the background. I don't know how well you can make that out, but there's one up in the upper right, and there's a few over here on the left as well. We found this field that, I don't know, there must have been 15 or 20 plants, most of them in bloom at the same time. And that's pretty rare. These flowers, they only grow in soil underneath rotting logs. Very specific type of soil. And I think they're oak logs, but I may be wrong. No, that wouldn't be oak logs. Anyway, there's a certain kind of log that falls to when they fall, they start to rot, and that leaches the bacteria into the soil. And that's what actually triggers these to bloom. So they're a difficult flower to find, the plant anyway, and they're even more difficult to find in bloom. So magnolia in a garden again. Some more accessories. So extension tubes, if you remember from one of the first slides, I told you that macro lenses do what they do by extending the focus group of the lens farther from the sensor in the camera. Well, if there was a way that we could do that with a normal lens, we'd be able to focus closer and we'd be able to get more magnification out of a normal lens. And then we can do that. And the thing that we use is something called an extension tube or tubes. They generally come in sets. They're usually in sets of 3. You can buy them individually, but 99% of the time you'll see them in sets like this. They are 3 different depths or thicknesses of tube. You can use them in any combination, 1, 2, any 2 of them or all 3 of them together. And they just fit in between the lens and the camera. You usually just put them on the back of the lens, put that on the camera. You can do it the other way around. Excuse me. They're available for almost any camera that's out there. Anything that's ever been made, you'll probably find a set of extension tubes, even as a current product from a manufacturer. And the amount of magnification that you're going to get from them depends on the lens that you're using in the first place. So a shorter macro lens with all 3 extension tubes is going to get a lot more magnification out of them than a longer lens would. Excuse me, I don't know what's going on. So if I put these on a 50, 60, 70 millimeter range lens, I might get 2 or 3 times life-size reproduction. If I put these on a 150 or a 180, I might only get 33 or 55% or 50% more magnification out of them. All right, macro rails, nodal rails. Like I told you before about using a rail or a long lens plate as a rail, you can actually buy macro rails that are specifically designed for this. You could spend 50 bucks on them. You could spend $1,000 on them. There's a huge range here. And then there's another level actually above that. Some of them are just rails. Some of them are geared. Some of them are one directional, so they'll move forward or backward. Some of them stack, so they'll move forward and backward and left and right. And then they make geared versions of those. There are actually electronic setups. I believe the company is called Cognisys. That makes a product that you put the whole camera in, and it will control the movement of the camera forward, backward, left, right, up, down. It will refocus your lens for you and take lots of pictures. If you've ever seen pictures of bugs' eyes and things that are that tiny, that's the way it's done. It's impossible to focus that precisely, and it's done by hand anyway, and it's done in a series of hundreds of images and then stacked back together. We'll get back to that one. Soft brush, if you want to clean out a flower. Don't recommend it if you're in a national park or a state park or something like that, but in a normal garden, in your backyard, inside, whatever, a big makeup brush, a big paint brush, just something that's really soft you can use to clean out dead bugs and twigs and whatever that are in flowers. Spray bottles. Told you I'd teach you how to fake that morning dew shot. You go to a drugstore and find glycerin. I generally mix it 50% glycerin, 50% water, shake it up, and then when you spray it on, it has a lot more viscosity, so the beads of sweat, the beads of water, glycerin, will basically stay where they fall. So they won't just run off like normal water would. You can use water, but it's a lot harder to control. You can use pure glycerin, just take a toothpick and you can put drops exactly where you want them to be. That's kind of old product photography tricks, like photographing a Coke bottle with beads of sweat on it, even when the Coke bottle is room temperature. There's a device called a plamp. There's a picture of it on the left. It's short for plant clamp. It's made by a company called Wimberley. There are all sorts of other devices. So that clamps on a tripod, clamps on a tree, whatever. The other end, the original clamp was designed to hold a flower stem steady and keep the flower from moving around as much. The clamp 2 is a little bit stiffer. You can use it to hold reflectors and things like that as well. Any kind of clamps, I use a product called Gear Tie. They're kind of like giant twist ties. You can buy them at any hardware store. You can wrap those around a tripod leg, around the back of a chair. You can use them to prop subjects up and backgrounds and things like that. But they fit in camera bags better than some of the bigger stuff. It's just out of arm's reach, but I've got a whole bin of clamps over there. Just regular hardware store clamps, pony clamps, if you're familiar, A clamps, whatever you want to call them. I use those to set up props, to hold up backgrounds, all sorts of things like that. Speaking of backgrounds, again, I told you how to fake, I would teach you how to fake that first indoor shot. I think I have some others that were set up inside as well. The first thing is go to photograph some backgrounds or look online. I'm sure you can find some stock pictures or free photos that you could use, but you can create your own. Go photograph the woods, some flowers, some hay, the sky, whatever the case may be, whatever you think would make a good background, photograph it, but photograph it out of focus. Just blur the lens, take a picture out of focus. You can go into Lightroom or Photoshop and blur it more. And then you can print them out. 11 by 14 is fine for most things. 16 by 20 is probably the biggest you'd ever need. And then just mount it to a piece of poster board, a piece of mat board, something like that, and you can prop it up on the table behind your subject. You can tape it to the wall behind the subject, whatever you need to be able to do, and then that's going to be your natural looking background. And then inside, you're going to use some sort of artificial light. Keep in mind, anytime we use artificial light, we're trying to mimic or complement natural light. Very rarely do we light things that from underneath or odd positions like that, right? So if I'm using artificial lighting, I'm going to take a panel like this, I'm going to turn it on and hold it above the subject and about a 45-degree angle. So afternoon light, morning light, something like that. Maybe a little bit lower, but I'm not going to light it from underneath, and I'm not going to light it from directly above. I'm going to be over here at an angle. I'm going to be somewhere between the camera axis pointing toward the subject and full side. I don't really want to be over here because, again, I'm going to cast a harsh shadow on the side. So something over here is a good natural looking way to light a subject. I might use two. I might have one soft light underneath or way off. I might have a light on the background as well. So always things to consider. So with and without light, the first is light coming in from the first image is just natural light. The one on the right, there's light coming from the left, so it's illuminating the inside of the flower a little bit better. Light that rakes across a subject shows off texture and detail better, so you see a little bit of that on the surface of the flower as well. Another thing about lighting the subject, if I don't add light to the background, it's going to make the background go darker, right? I add more light to the subject, I compensate the exposure for the subject, makes the background go darker. Some people like that, some people don't. Extension tubes, so the left without extension tubes, the right was with a full set of extension tubes. I tried this with the 50mm first because you'd get more magnification out of it, but you end up with a ½ an inch of working distance, so it was just unusable. So I had to switch to the 70 in order to get this. And it's about 2.5 times life-size reproduction. One technique really fast, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on this because it could be a class all into itself. Sometimes no matter what you do, you can't get everything in focus. The only things you can do to get more depth of field, turn the aperture higher. The higher the number, the more depth of field you're going to have. I can back up. The farther I am from the subject, the more depth of field I have. So if I back up a couple inches, I will get a little bit more depth of field. It's not going to change a lot, but it might be enough to get what you're looking for. When this was shot with a D600 that was, I believe, 24 megapixels, I didn't want to waste any of them. Today with higher resolution cameras, I'm not as averse to backing up a little bit, knowing that I have to crop in camera later. The third option is something called focus stacking, and that's taking a series of images with a shallower depth of field and then letting the computer stack back together or recombine the in-focus elements. You start at the front, photograph toward the back. I believe this one on the right was a series of 22 images shot at 5.6 instead of 22. So they're shorter shutter speeds, just easier to photograph all the way around, and then the computer can put it back together. Lightroom and Photoshop do it. I use a product called Zerene, Z-E-R-E-N-E, because everybody asks. The other option out there is, I'm blanking on it at the moment. Anyway, we'll come back to it. There's one other product out there that will combine Helicon Focus. There you go. Thank you. So those are the other two options for putting images together. That's another image with focus stacking. There's no way in the world to get that composition in a single exposure and get all the hairs on the fly in focus. It's just not possible. So settings, I'm going to start by telling you that I do almost everything I do in manual, almost everything in manual. The one time that I'm going to use autofocus or rely on autofocus is if I'm doing birds in flight or something that moves. Then I'm going to let the camera do the focus for me. For flowers, it can be really tough to use autofocus. We're going to talk about this one down below. But if I'm shooting a white flower, there's nothing for the camera to focus on. There's no texture, no detail, no shadow, no contrast. It's very, very difficult for the camera to focus on a solid white subject anyway. But then, even if I move the point of focus around, if the flower starts to move a little bit, the point jumps from the front of the flower to the back of the petals. I don't know what part of the flower it's going to focus on. And every time I'm taking a picture, it's going to try to refocus. So I might use autofocus to get me in the right ballpark, but then I'm going to switch to manual. Since we're on this point already, I then use magnification. I have the center button on the back command dial, command, whatever. The center button is set to magnification if I'm in live view. So I hit that button, and wherever the focus point is in the image enlarges to 100%. So then I can focus very, very critically and very, very accurately. A lot of mirrorless cameras have a thing called peaking, where you can get a kind of fringe. It gives you a colored edge to something that's in focus. That's a good reference as well. Whatever it is that you have on your camera, utilize the tools that you have at your disposal. So aperture is going to be my starting point for the exposure triangle. Aperture, shutter speed, ISO. The first one that matters the most, or the one that matters the most to me, is going to be aperture. So that's the one I'm going to look at first. When I pull my camera out of the bag, when I'm looking at the first shot, before I even get there, my camera is probably already set to f11. There are times you've seen in here, there are times that I may go down to f8, rarely to 5.6. There are plenty of times that I'm going to go up to f11, f16, maybe even f22. But I'm going to start at f11. That's just where I'm going to walk around with the camera, and then I'll adjust as I need more depth of field or can get away with less when I'm shooting something. Because this always comes up, I'm aware of diffraction. Diffraction is just a loss of sharpness at higher apertures. Theoretically, your camera, your lens is not as sharp at f22 or f32 or whatever it goes to as it is at f5.6 or f8. My answer to that is this. I'd rather have a picture that's slightly less sharp with everything in focus than a picture that's technically sharp with only half the subject in focus, or half the way I wanted it in focus. And the real answer is just try it. Take different pictures, look at them at 100% on the screen and compare them. See how much sharpness you lose at the higher apertures. Some lenses are better than others. The next thing is going to be shutter speed. And again, my starting point is going to be about 125. What I find with most macro lenses, 125th of a second is enough to freeze a little bit of motion caused by a little bit of wind or you know, a soft breeze, something like that. If it's moving faster, I'm going to turn it up. I may be at 250. I might be at 500 even if the wind is blowing a good bit. And I'm still going to wait in between gusts of wind to try to get a photograph. There are times that I turn it down to 60 or 30. Rarely can I get away with anything less than that, even if it seems like the stillest, calmest, most beautiful morning in the world. When you set the camera up, look through it in the viewfinder and the flower starts to dance. Even if you don't feel the breeze, the flower is probably still going to be moving around a little bit. Then ISO, again, starting point, I'm going to be somewhere around 800 or 1600. Because my aperture is going to be on the higher end, because my shutter speed has to be a little bit higher in order to freeze motion, my ISO generally has to be up around 1800 or 1600 with a decent amount of light, maybe a few clouds in the sky. If it's overcast, if it's early in the morning, late in the evening, I'll probably have to turn it up. If there's a lot of movement or I need a lot of depth of field, I'll have to turn that up. If I can get away with it, I'm always going to turn it lower. I'd much rather take a picture at 400 ISO with just enough shutter speed to freeze the motion rather than 3200 ISO and shoot at 1,000th of a second. Flower doesn't know the difference between 125th or 1,000th of a second, but you'll see a difference in the image with a lower ISO. We'll have cleaner images and better color. White balance to daylight. At least I know that point my white balance will be neutral at noon, 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock maybe. But that early morning light and evening light that starts to get warmer is going to record as warmer light. If I leave the white balance in neutral or in auto, it's going to try to neutralize those colors. The other problem here is we're shooting flowers that have color. If your camera tries to read the center area and looks at a red flower, it's going to try to neutralize the red of the flower. And that's the last thing in the world we want. So you want to be in daylight at least, but you want to be at least in a set white balance, but daylight to me is the way to go because you're going to keep the warmer colors in the morning and the evening. Last trick for settings here is use your histograms. If you're not familiar, a histogram is just a graph. Black is on the left, white is on the right. Base or no exposure is on the bottom, and the top is the highest exposure that you have in an image. There's no absolute. It doesn't tell you that 100 pixels are pure white or whatever the case may be. It's just a representation of the values, the exposure values in your image. So a histogram of a white subject is going to have a spike on the right side. A histogram of a dark subject is going to have a spike on the left side, or should, if you want it to come out looking the way you saw it. What you don't want to do is have the histogram, the graph, clip or push up against one edge or the other. If the graph pushes all the way to the right edge and instead of dropping off right at the corner, pushes all the way to the edge of the frame or the edge of the histogram, you lose detail in your highlights. If it does that on the left, you're losing detail in your shadows. So ideally, you want to keep it in between. Flowers, though, I'm going to tell you to take it one step further than that. And that is find your RGB histograms. It's in your camera somewhere. Very few cameras have I ever looked at that you can't find an RGB histogram, especially in today's cameras. Even if it's in an image review after the fact, that's fine. Take a picture, find your RGB histogram, and look at the image with those turned on. If you photograph a red flower, your white histogram or your composite overall histogram might look perfect. But when you look at the RGB histograms, the red is going to be overexposed. Red overexposed still means you have no detail in the red. If your red flower is your subject, you want to keep detail in the flower. So you want to make sure that all three channels don't clip. Even though, and so like I said, one might clip and the average histogram still looks right. If you have to sacrifice, lose shadow detail instead of highlight detail, it's less distracting to the human eye. Another setup shot, perfectly real flower. Another trick that I learned in photo school, again, more from portrait photography, but light is light. You can look at shadows. You can tell the direction of the light. You can tell the distance or the size of the light. You can tell the color of the light, all sorts of things like that. So I know in this image, the petal on the left is illuminated and it's casting a shadow underneath. It's not directly to the side, it's not directly behind. So the light is somewhere over here at about 45 degrees. It's up a little bit higher, pointing down, right? Because you can see the flower, the shadow cast by the petal on the stamen that are sticking out underneath. So like I was telling you, I'm trying to mimic that natural looking light. It's a relatively small source because the edge of the shadow is relatively clean. The smaller the light source is in relation to the subject, the sharper the edge of the shadow and the darker the shadow will be. The hardest shadow in the world to mimic is true sunlight because the sun is so small relative to the subject and so far away that it casts very hard edges and very dark shadows. Fortunately, we don't have to have shadows that dark to mimic that. But complete other extreme, it is still, well, it's not natural light, it's light in an aquarium. I didn't bring any, add any extra light to this, but even to get F16, you can see his hind legs are starting to go soft, head's in focus, front body's in focus, everything exactly the way I wanted to capture that much in focus. I didn't feel like I needed to go any higher than that. I needed a 50th of a second in order to handhold this, even with stabilization in the camera. And in order to get that in these lighting conditions, I had to turn the ISO up to 6400. That's just the reality of the situation. Is it ideal? No. Is there some noise when you zoom into 100%? Yes. Is it something that I could get rid of or relatively easily minimize in post using Luminar or something like that? Absolutely. And it's still a very viable image. A lot of people are afraid of 3200, 6400 ISOs, and there's really no reason to be. Today's cameras are perfectly capable of shooting at these higher ISOs, even if you have to clean things up in post. Real quick sales pitch just to show you how sharp this 105 Dgdn and our new 105 macro art is. Full frame on the left. All I did is trim a little bit off the top and the bottom, but there's really no crop in that at all. And then on the right, you can see a magnification, however much that is, 200 or 300% magnification, and you can see how much detail there is in the center of that flower, just how sharp that lens really is. On a high resolution camera, admittedly, but I'll leave you with a few tips and then we'll take some time for questions. I know we've kind of gone over here. The first thing is the lens is more important than the camera. I know that's easy for me to say because I work for a company that primarily makes lenses. But for macro photography, it's really, really, really true. Like I said before, you could work with an older camera and still get great macro images. You're not going to be able to use a kind of generic all-around lens and get truly great macro images. You're just limiting the capabilities of the system. Having a lens that's designed to do this kind of work and do it well will give you a lot more consistent results. Always trying to eliminate motion. There's always something, right? If I'm holding the camera, I'm magnifying the lens itself is magnifying the motion of the camera. The subject is moving, and again, the lens is magnifying the motion in the subject. So I can use a tripod. I want to use a cable release when I am. I can add light to the situation because that can help me get to higher shutter speeds. And then I can turn my shutter speed higher, even if I have to turn my ISO higher. Exposure is always a challenge. You could go out and photograph a waterfall on a tripod. It doesn't really matter. You might shoot at 8 seconds or something like that. Totally fine. Trying to photograph macro, you're not going to be able to photograph something at 8 seconds. Even if the camera's not moving, the subject probably is. And I put this in quotes, macro lenses eat light. This is the way I think about it. It's the way that I visualize, the way my mind works. But any lens that is capable of macro, any lens that it can reproduce a subject at 1:1, when it is at its highest maximum magnification, when it is a true life-size reproduction, you lose 2 stops of light. It's physics. It doesn't matter what the lens is. It doesn't matter what the focal length is, but the image circle is twice as big as it was before, and the surface area of a circle, when I double the diameter, I have 1/4 of the surface area, or the surface area. And that's volume of light if you think about it that way. So I'm going to lose 2 stops of light. I have 1/4. 1 stop is half, 2 stops is 1/4 as much light. So even if I'm photographing at a distance, I might have a usable shutter speed. When I'm focusing on macro, I've lost 2 stops of light. Canon and Sony, they leave the aperture number alone. I'm pretty sure. I have to look at the Sony again. I know Canon does this. As I focus closer, if I'm in aperture priority, it will adjust the shutter speed as though I'm losing 2 stops of light, or for the 2 stops of light I'm losing, but it won't change the aperture. Nikon changes the F number to show you the effective aperture due to the light loss in the lens. So a lot of people ask, well, my lens was at f2.8 and then I zoomed into macro or focused in on macro and I lost my 2.8 aperture. Why won't the lens go to 2.8 anymore? It's still at 2.8. The blades didn't move. It's just showing you how much light loss there is in the lens. And that's just Nikon's way of doing it. Depth of field we covered. There's never really enough depth of field. It doesn't mean that everything you photograph has to be in perfect focus all the way from front of the subject to back of the subject. Sometimes we want it that way. Sometimes we use shallow depth of field to isolate certain portions of the subject and highlight them. And the composition, and this one I'm going to kind of lean into what y'all are going to be doing, or some of you are going to be doing next week as well. When I teach workshops, we always have a wrap-up session. We look at images like we'll be doing in the image critique in a week and a half or 2 weeks, whenever that is. And the number one comment, not from me, but from other participants when they look at images is, that's really great. Why didn't you get in closer? A lot of people aren't aware of what a macro lens can really do. My suggestion to you, whenever you're trying out a new macro lens, flip it to manual, turn the focus all the way around to its closest, and then move yourself with the camera closer to the subject until your subject is in focus. Like I said, a lot of people aren't aware of what 1:1 really looks like. And again, you don't have to shoot everything that way, but shoot something close, shoot something farther away, look at it from the left, from the right, from up above, from down below, look at it from the back, try it horizontally, try it vertically. The greatest thing in the world to me about digital photography is we've already paid for the camera and the lens and the memory card. So all I have to do when I get back to Lightroom is go delete, 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 right? To all the ones that I don't care about. But you will learn more from your mistakes than you will from your successes. You'll learn more from other people's successes or mistakes. as well. So look at images, figure out what you like, but also figure out why you like it. So my challenge to you when you're photographing at the Botanical Gardens, wherever it is you're going, and I wish I could be with you. I love going out to photograph flowers, but it's a little far for me to travel to go photograph flowers. But my challenge to you is this: take interesting images, create interesting photographs. One of my favorite photographers once said, don't take pictures of something, create images that are something. So don't just capture an image of a beautiful flower, try to create beautiful images that showcase that flower. Same would go with bugs or anything else that you're going to be photographing as well. Definitely not true macro, but close enough, close focus to show you what the 150 to 600 could do. Mostly it's because my class was laying down in the middle of a road, photographing this with their macro lenses, and I didn't want to make them wait for me after they were done. I didn't want to block the road any longer than we were there. So I just pulled out the 150 to 600 to see if it would get anything photographing over their shoulders. And I was pretty happy with it. It's another the wild orchid at the gardens in Nashville. And this is, oh my goodness, it's an orchid. It's a cultivated orchid. I don't remember the variety. I apologize. Might be an oncidium. Any case, that's right here in my living room. The flower was sitting right here on the edge of this table. That's actually the same background that you see here. And by warming up the light on the subject, but then changing the white balance to neutralize that, makes the background light go colder. So I can make the background look cooler in tone than this neutral background that's behind me. Or, yeah, pretty neutral. Okay. Are we back?
Awesome. Thanks, Brett.
Absolutely.
So we covered all the questions that came up. There was one that I think I answered, but I'd like to pitch to you just to see if we have a different answer. Someone was asking about your favorite. If you had to recommend one lens, if you could only pick one macro lens to work with, which one would it be?
So a few years ago, I would have told you it was our 150 EX, which is now a discontinued model, but that on my SLR, I really, really loved. It's a great lens, it's sharp, but it's big and heavy, and so is the Nikon camera and everything else. Today, hands down, the 105 Dgdn. Yeah, it is by far the best macro lens I have ever used. And I know it's easy for me to say. Come to the Botanical Gardens next week, and they'll put one in your hands and prove to you just how sharp that lens really is. It is probably in the top 5 or 10 sharpest lenses I've ever used of any kind. By far the sharpest macro lens. The focus is absolutely incredible. The precision of the focus even for handheld stuff. I just love the lens all the way around.
Yeah, I had a feeling, but there we go. So if anyone has any other questions that we haven't addressed yet, be sure to put them in the Q&A now so we can get them answered before we break for the session. But while everyone's thinking about what we learned and if there's any last questions, I just want to say big thank you to Brett for sharing all that information with us.
Absolutely.
And thank you to Kenmore Camera for hosting us. If you'd like to see us again, I'm going to be in with Kenmore Camera on Sunday. If you're in the area, you can stop by and ask more questions or see some of the stuff in person. And we do still have spots open for our workshop on Monday. So there's a link in the chat. You can also find all that information on Kenmore Camera's site, kenmorecamera.com. Otherwise, we hope to catch you at another virtual session down the road.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Brett. That was awesome.
Thank you very much.
Love all those flowers. And we had some great like crowdsourcing of gardens and places to shoot and flowers, botanical names for flowers that you couldn't remember, but thank you everybody. And yeah, if you're local, be sure to come and see Aaron on Sunday. He'll have macro lenses. You can talk to him about macro lenses, but we'll also have the 150 to 600 and all Sigma's other lenses. And if you want to come to the Botanical Gardens, it is in our events page and it's in the chat here. So if you scroll back up and just click on the link, it'll open in another window and you can join us because it's going to be fun. I'm looking forward to it. So
absolutely.
if it's
Anyway.
okay, I'll answer just a couple of these.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah,
look at all these that came in.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No. I just, before I lose them, somebody asked what the closest Sigma lens would be to Sony's 90mm macro. We make a 70 and a 105. The 105 really is going to be closer. There's not as much difference between a 90 and a 105 as there is between a 70 and a 90. It's really just a question of whether you want to shoot a little bit larger, a little bit smaller. On a full frame Sony, I would go with the 105 every time. So the question then to macro lenses for Nikon. We make a 105EX. It's the only thing that we make in a Nikon mount. It isn't an F mount. It will work on Nikon's F to Z adapter. The focus may not be as fast on the Z on that adapter as it would be on an SLR, but for macro, that probably doesn't matter anyway. And it's a good, solid, sharp lens, so it would work fine. So I told you the LED is no longer available. It's just this model. This was the M180, and they just don't make this model, but Photox makes a ton of them. I'm sure that anybody at Kenmore Camera could tell us other companies as well. I'm just not up on all of the different brands of lighting, but I know there are others that make this those thin LED panels as well. So just go visit Kenmore Camera and they will be happy to find you one that's perfect for what you're doing.
Brett, was there a photographer that you had quoted? I didn't catch that one.
Yeah, the one that I quoted, his name is Keith Carter. He was a photographer in Texas. I assume he's still around. I haven't looked him up in years. But, yeah, and I'll often mention his name. It was at the end of a presentation that he gave, and he left the audience with that quote. And I met him afterward and talked to him for a while. And I said, if it's okay with you, I'm going to steal that quote. And he said, it's fine. I didn't come up with it. I said, okay, good. So I don't know who to attribute it to, really. I just give him props for it. So. Okay. All right. I think that will cover everything that I've seen here. Thank you, Aaron, for all of your help. You're always fantastic to have on here. Thank you to Kenmore Camera, and thank you to Sigma for making this all happen today. Have fun shooting on Monday, and make sure that you send some images in for us to review when we have the review session.
Yeah, I'll give everybody that info when we're over at the gardens. And we'll see you online for that. That's going to be fun. But thank you, Aaron. You answered an incredibly huge amount of questions, 40 something questions in there. You're just back there killing it. So thank you. I know, right? I'm just like, woo, doing the hard work in the background, Aaron, there. So thank you again for that. And thank you, Sigma, and thank you, Brett. And everybody have a good weekend. Friday's here. All right. Bye, you guys.
See you, everybody.